Morning, church. Good to see you this morning. We're grateful that you're here. We have visitors. Thank you for coming. I hope and pray that you have a safe journey to your respective abodes when we're over, but hope and pray that you'll come back and be with us whenever you possibly can. We have several that are out this morning, and I want to look around and remember those and maybe give them a call, see what's going on. Hopefully everything's all right. They're just visiting somewhere else this morning. But we're glad to see you. As we bring to a close, we really brought to a close last week, but I've added kind of one more this morning in our series of lessons on things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. And this morning I want us to look at pride. There's a story told, it's a made-up story, but it's a story that illustrates the point. Story of, the lion was always considered the king of the jungle. An old lion wanted to make sure that he was still king of the jungle, and so he bypassed all the little animals. But he went to a tiger and he said, "Tiger," he said, "I need you to tell me something." And Tiger said, "Sure, what's that?" He said, "Who's king of the jungle?" And he said, "Why, lion?" He said, "Everybody knows you're king of the jungle." He said, "Fine, thank you," and he went on. Went down the path a little way and he found a bear and he said, "Mr. Bear," he said, "I want to talk to you." And the bear said, "All right, what do you want to talk about?" He said, "I need to know something." "Sure, what do you need to know?" He said, "I want to know who's the king of the jungle." He said, "Well, Mr. Lion," he said, "of course you are. Without a doubt. No question about it. You're the king of the jungle." He said, "Thank you." And his chest puffed out a little bit further. And he went on down the road and there he saw an elephant. He said, "Mr. Elephant, I want to talk to you." Elephant said, "Fine." He said, "Elephant," he said, "Mr. Elephant, who's king of the jungle?" Elephant picked him up, tossed him down on the ground a few times, threw him out into the water till he almost drowned, picked him back up, threw him against a tree, patted him again several more times, and the lion looked at him and he said, "Well, if you didn't know, you didn't have to get mean about it." There's a sense of pride and arrogance that comes in all of our lives. There's a sense of over self-worth. It's been said that pride is what caused the downfall of Haman as he was hung upon his own gallows, and it's true. Pride overcame Nebuchadnezzar to the point that he was cast out of really society and made to eat like a wild animal or an animal. It's also, we know that the apostles' mothers, James and John, Miss Zebedee, she came and wanted her boys to sit at the head table. Well, pride overtaking even some good folks' mama. We look in the Bible and we see folks that are overcome with the sense of self-worth. They're wonderful. You see, they can do no wrong. They think they know everything. They think they have the answer to everything. And they think that not only that they know and have the answer to everything, but they can do everything. There was a lady one time, not of this congregation, but of another congregation I was at the time. And she came to me and we were talking about a particular young person in our congregation. And this lady said, she said, "I don't know where that young lady got all of her confidence, but she can do anything and everything." This was a lady that also knew how to bake and baked well, baked cakes for people and sold them and gave them weddings and different things. And she'd taken this young girl in and she said that girl thought she knew everything. And she said, "I tried to tell her," and she said, "I know that, I know that, I know this." And she said she didn't know anything, but she had a tremendous sense of confidence that she thought she knew everything. Well, sometimes that pride gets us, doesn't it? Pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. Proverbs 16, verse 25. Pride can cause us great harm. And we all deal with it to a certain extent. And while all that's in the world, lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and pride of life is not of the Father, 1 John chapter 2, world, we do know that sometimes our pride overtakes us. It gets the best of us. It shows us up and shows us off. But we have to understand and we have to ask ourselves, what is it? What is pride? Well, pride by definition, understanding pride, and when we define it this way: a sense of self-importance and self-evaluation, really to the point of arrogance, that is above and beyond what it should be and what it is. It's this idea that I know and I feel and I understand and I don't need anybody, I don't need anything. And we might not say that, That's the feeling. Pride, while leads to destruction, can be both good and bad. You see, when we have a sense of self-respect and self-worth, it's good. A sense of self-dignity. That we take care of ourselves and we take care of our property and our belongings. We'll talk about different types of pride. There's intellectual pride, and there's pride with regards to, say, face and race. There's pride with regards to what we own. There's pride intellectually, or we're smart. There's good pride, but then there's pride that goes to seed. That pride that we've kind of already discussed. That pride that says, I know everything, I can do everything, I'm the best. It's an over-evaluation of self. It's an over-evaluation of who we are and what we're worth and what we can do. Oh, we may be good in one area, but we can't be good in all areas. We may be good in something that we've been trained in. We may be good in something that we've specifically studied, but we can't be good in everything. And so while pride can be good from the standpoint of we take care of ourselves and what we have, and we feel good about ourselves, pride can become overinflated. And so as we look at that, we have to understand that it is that which is often seen. Uzziah, his pride was seen. Haman, his pride was seen. Nebuchadnezzar, in Daniel, the 4th chapter, his pride was seen. His pride was seen in the fact that he thought that he had built up Babylon, and he refused to give God the glory. And as we said in the introduction, God condemned him for a period of time to eat of the grass, the ground. Ananias and Sapphira were prideful. Well, wait a minute, preacher. Really? I mean, all they did was, they came in and they kept back part of the portion of which they'd sold, and they then gave to God, but they said, we've given everything. See, the pride caused them to say, I know more than God. In 1 Samuel, the 13th chapter, we see the pride of Saul. Saul was asked as he was king at the time, why in the world had he made this sacrifice that was something that God had not commanded? And you remember what he said? He said, well, I saw the people. And he said, I saw that they were in disarray. And so I thought that this sacrifice would help them. You see, here's what he said. I thought, not what God said, but what I thought. Well, on and on we could go, and we'll see other examples as we continue in this lesson this morning. Pride, when it takes over our lives, can consume us to the point that we don't need anyone. It's sort of like a man one time turned in something to me, and he made this statement. He says, the young think they know everything, and those of us that are old do. And I thought, we have a problem. We have a pride problem. We see that in people's lives. And yet the Bible says that doesn't need to be part of our life. You see, pride ultimately has downfall. As we said in the introduction in Proverbs 16th chapter, pride goes before destruction, the haughty spirit before fall. So what's the downfall? Well, we're told in Proverbs 21 and verse 5 that a haughty look and a proudful heart and plowing among the wicked is a sin. Solomon doesn't cut any corners. He doesn't, if you will, he doesn't kind of soft soap it and say, well, it might be a sin, could be a sin. It's something that maybe you need to stay away from. He says it's a sin. So what's he telling us? Solomon is telling us God doesn't want these things. God doesn't want a haughty look. God doesn't want a prideful heart. God doesn't want us to be individuals that are participating with the or with the wicked, rather, because why? It's a sin. See, we're told, stay away from it. And inasmuch as if we understand it, then we say, okay, we then need to stay away from it. We understand that's enough. But the reality of it is we still have to say, well, really, what's wrong with it? Other than the fact that God said, don't do it. Well, excuse me, that's enough. But let's go beyond that. You see, pride often leads us to trust what? Trust our own righteousness. Pride often leads us to say, I know really more than God knows. I am one that trusts my own righteousness than the righteousness of God. The story in Luke, the 18th chapter, in verse 10. You remember it quite well. Well, actually, it begins a little earlier than that, but verse 10 following, you see the story. It's the story of the publican and the Pharisee. We know it well. We've alluded to it before. It's the story of one man that should have been considered righteous, and he was, but the world would not have considered him righteous. He was the publican. The Pharisee, who was to be the righteous one because he was supposed to be the religious one, if you will, but he turned out to be the prideful one. The Pharisee, as he went to pray, he's the man that threw open his arms, threw his head back, and he prayed, oh God, I thank you that I'm not like other men. Wow. That I'm not even as this publican. You know, I wonder if he even knew the publican. You know, it's sort of like years ago, I was in an area, and there was a preacher that came in and started one of our own brethren, but a congregation. And those of us in the area couldn't figure out why, because we had several. And he said the reason he started it was because of a belief that he had that he said we didn't have. And I asked an area preacher, I said, did he come talk to you? He said, well, no. I said, well, good, because he didn't come talk to me either. So how does he know what I believe? Oh, good question. Sometimes we trust in our own righteousness, and we're like that old Pharisee. Oh, God, I'm wonderful. But remember, the publican smote himself on the breast and kept smoting himself on the breast and asked God to be merciful to me, a sinner. God reminds us that it's those that humble themselves that he takes care of. Sometimes, though, we trust in our own righteousness. In other words, we don't need to listen to God. Why in 1 Samuel, the 15th chapter, why did Saul bring back Agag the king? Why did he bring back some of the sheep? Now, I know what he said. You know what he said, too. He said that he brought them to offer them as a sacrifice to God. What was the rebuke that was given to him? Whole sacrifice is better. To hearken is better. To listen to God, to do what God has said. That's the way we should do it. You see, when we go to the Bible and we begin to read it and then we begin to make up excuses, when we begin to say, yes, but, or I know it says that, but, when we begin to say, well, I'm going to rely upon the grace of God, we're trusting in our own righteousness. And when we begin to trust in our own righteousness, we don't need God. Our pride has become greater than God, and our even faith and trust in God. And we need to understand that the downfall of pride is that sometimes we trust in our own righteousness. But sometimes the downfall is that we trust in our own strength, right? Trust in our own strength. Not the strength of God, but our own strength. Do you remember in Kadesh, in Numbers, the 20th chapter, God had told Moses to speak to the rock. Now, earlier, God had told him to strike the rock. But now he had told him, because you see, there's no water, and the people need water. They're thirsty. They want something. And so God has instructed him, speak to the rock. And what does he do? He strikes the rock. Once again, his own pride destroyed his and made himself righteous over God. But he was relying really upon his own strength and not the strength. We could look at as well. We could look at 1 Kings, the 12th chapter, and we could see we could see Jeroboam. We could also look in Leviticus 10, see Nadab and Abihu. But let's look at Jeroboam for a minute. In 1 Kings, the 12th chapter, Israel has split. It's become two nations. From one nation to two, Israel to the north and Judah to the south. They're divided. They each have their own kings now. But they've gone their own way. They've done their own thing the way they wanted to do it. And Israel is to the north. And Israel, by the way, never had a righteous king. In 1 Kings 12, Jeroboam begins to think as he's king over Israel. He begins to think, there are certain times a year where folks are going to have to go back to Jerusalem and give God the glory for sacrifice, to make that yearly pilgrimage. If they go back to Jerusalem, they're going to want to stay in Judah. I'm going to lose all my people. I'm going to lose my kingdom, and I can't have that. And so, lo and behold, what does he do? He builds two idols, Dan and Beersheba, farthest northern point and farthest southern point. And he says those folks can worship God there. The idols establish his own righteousness, placing them where God did not even want anything placed. God wanted him worshipped in Jerusalem at the time. Count my own strength. We mentioned Nadab and Abihu. They also would be great examples as they offered strength fire in Leviticus, the 10th chapter. Once again, I know more. Pride had truly destroyed them, but pride also leads us to trust in our own wisdom. I know it all. I know exactly what I need. I don't need anything else. Paul reminds us in Romans 12 and verse 3, I say through the grace of the Lord, or grace that God has given to me, to not think of ourselves more highly than we ought to think. While we should understand that the way of man is not in himself, it's not in man that walks to direct his steps, it's up to God. I want you to think about something, and we're going to come back to this idea here in weeks, but I want you to think about something. I want you to think about this idea. Does the Bible lead your life, or do you lead the Bible? Now, what I mean by that, and like I say, I'm going to come back to this in a couple of weeks, is do you let the Bible decide how you're going to live your life, thus letting God show you the way you lead your life? Or do you lead your life and then go back to the Bible to try to tell it and justify what you've done and tell it how you are to live a life? Now, you ponder that, because as you ponder it, it'd be interesting to see what you have to say and how you live your life, but that's coming up in a couple of weeks. Pride says, it's my wisdom. It's not God's. So having seen the failure of pride, we've got to look at then the conclusion is that we simply replace God with our own wisdom and our own thoughts and our own ways. But there's a cure for that. What's the cure? The cure, first of all, is to possess the attitude of God. In Proverbs chapter 6, verse 16, you know it probably far better, even than I. There are 6 things that the Lord hates. Yes, 7 are abomination unto him. If I were to ask you, and if we were to take a poll today, what do you hate? I hate cauliflower. Me too. I hate long lines. Don't go shopping. I hate spending money. Don't look at the internet. We could go on. What does Solomon say God hates? Number 1, prideful look. You see, the downfall of pride causes us to forget God, forsake God, do what we want to do. God says, I do not like pride. God does what? God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. James 4 and verse 6. That's why he concludes in James chapter 4, verse 10, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he'll lift you up. We need to possess that attitude that God says, I don't like pride. Pride takes you away from me and not to me. It takes you away from me. And so let's don't be proud. Let's be humble. But then second of all, God's cure for pride is to remember that we're but men. You know, the psalmist in Psalm 90 verse 20 says, he kind of concludes, he says, we are but dust. That's all we are. We're dust. Well, who's in control? Well, God's in control. Our sufficiency is, according to 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 5, our sufficiency is not of ourselves. It is not in man that walks. It's not what we do. Our sufficiency is, according to what Paul said, and I think correctly so, our sufficiency is of God. Jesus said it this way. In John 15 and verse 5, he says, I'm the vine, and you are the branches. He that abides in me will bear forth much fruit. You see, it's not us. We're not God. Well, who is God? God is God. And if God is God, and if God is a God that is constant and God is true, and he is, then we have to understand he's the one that's in charge, not us. We're simply men following what God has told us to follow. And in order to overcome pride, in order to be the humble person that we need to be, we need to understand we're simply men and we're not God. But then thirdly, we need to moderate our thinking. We need to think like God, yes, but we need to moderate our thinking. You see, Paul said in Galatians 6 and verse 3 that if any man does what? If any man thinks himself to be something when he's nothing, he deceives himself. Now, some look at that verse and say, well, God means that my self-worth and my self-esteem have to be lower than anything this world has. No. God wants us to understand we have that self-worth. We have that self-dignity that we talked about in the first point. But he also wants us to understand not to think more highly than we ought to think. Romans 12, and we've already looked at it in verse 3. We understand then that our thinking must be such that we moderate our thinking to think like God, to think with God, to be directed by God in our thinking. But then also, in order to overcome pride, we have to crucify ourselves. In Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, Paul says, I'm crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live. Yet not I, but Christ lives in me. In the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith, Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. Just think about that for a minute. Paul said that I'm crucified with Christ. We understand the cross. And we understand that in first century thinking, the cross was different than what we think of. We adore the cross. Why? Because of the blessings that we have from the cross. And so we wear it as necklaces and we incorporate it in art and we glorify it as should be correctly so. A terrible event with a wonderful outcome. We got that. But in first century thought, it was the most brutal, the most heinous of punishments. The Persians had actually perfected crucifying people, and they were known as some of the most brutal people of the world. Paul said that I am crucified with Christ. In other words, I died, and I died with Christ. I'm crucified with Christ, but he says, I'm still alive. Nevertheless, I live. But he said, in dying with Christ and dying to Christ, he said, the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith. Now, you can look at that word faith there a couple of different ways. You can look at it from the standpoint of 2 Corinthians chapter 5, that we walk by faith and not by sight. But you can carry that thought just a little bit further, and you can look at it a little differently, because there's an article. What's an article? The is the article. It's right before faith, the Greek text. And the faith means the doctrine, the truth, and it's used quite a few times in pages of the New Testament, some 50 times it's used, and it's referring to God's truth. And so Paul says, I'm crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. In the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith. I live according to God's way, God's instructions. And so we crucify self. Or David learned it best. In Psalm 51, where David is admitting his sin with Bathsheba and he's confessing his sins. The sacrifice that God wants is a humble and contrite heart, according to verse 17. Someone that follows God and not his own will and crucifies self. But then next, we cure our pride by understanding that we're debtors. We're debtors, first of all, to God. Paul asked this question in 1 Corinthians 4, verse 7. What do you have that you did not receive? Nothing. I think this outfit matches, and my wife didn't get a good look at it before we walked out this morning. Let me just tell you a little bit about it. It's an old suit coat that I ruined the pants to. The pants were bought by my dear wife a couple of weeks ago. She brought them in and she said, these are yours. Thank you. I want you to make sure she gets the credit. However, we receive. There's nothing Paul implies in the question. What do we have that we did not receive? We've received it all. We've received it from God. So we're debtors to God. We owe God. God owes you nothing. Pride says God owes me everything. God has to listen to me. God has to take what I'm willing to give him. Humility says, no, I'm willing to give him my all because of what he's given to me. But I'm not only a debtor to God, but I'm also a debtor to others. We're reminded in 1 Chronicles 29 and verse 12 that riches and honor all come from the Lord. And so I owe others, and I'm a debtor to others for the impact they make on my life. You see, you've greatly influenced me today. You've been here. You've sung beautifully. You've greeted me with your smiles. Some, as I was talking to others, have patted me on the back. Thank you. You'll talk to me on the way out, or at least I hope you will. I believe you will. Some will say nice things, and some will just greet, and that's all fine and good. Some will tell me about what's going on in their life, and some will tell me about the heartaches that's going on in their life, and even ask for prayers. And I'm glad to do that. But you've encouraged me by all of those actions. We're debtors to those that we come in contact with. And we need to remember that. And it'll help us overcome our pride. But we also need to pray. Lord, give me a humble heart. Give me a humble spirit. Lord, keep me humble. Now, sometimes it's rough, and you got to be careful what you pray for. Because sometimes God humbles us through difficulties. You know, when you look at the pages of the Old Testament, you find in Deuteronomy, the 8th chapter, you find really God asking the people and the people asking God, But here's the point. God says, he says, I have given you everything. Talking to the children of Israel. While, granted, walking in the wilderness. I've given you everything. I've carried you through everything. And he says, I've done this so that you might see me. What's the answer? The answer is sometimes we go through life's difficulties. We go through life's heartaches and hurts. But it's in order that we might see God. And so we have to pray that Lord, humble us. And if it carries us through some difficult times, so that we'll see God. But then we also, cure for pride is remember who we are, what we are. Who we are. We're God's children. Blessed to be God's children. Heirs of God, according to the promise that Peter has given to us, or Peter told us about in 1 Peter chapter 2. Adopted into the family of God, Paul told us in Ephesians chapter 1. We're God's. We belong to him. Purchased by the blood of Jesus Christ. As children, the family of God, heirs, we have the wonderful gift, God, and God in our life. And if we remember who we are and where we fit in, we'll help overcome our pride. See, it's not overly difficult, but it's not overly easy. Because we begin to feel good about ourselves. We accomplish things. We all the time, we accomplish things. Now, we may not have been a part of the recent shooting of the rocket that went around the moon and then came back, and they may not have been a part of that. NASA may not even been interested. Some of you may not even been interested in it. But in your own world, in your own way, you've accomplished certain things. And while you should be proud of the accomplishments that you made, don't let those accomplishments go to seed. Don't let that pride eat you up. And so Peter reminds us in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 6, humble yourselves therefore under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time. This morning, we humble ourselves by being obedient to his will. And if you have need of his invitation, won't you come? All together we stand and sing.